enormous power that cult leaders like Jim Jones and Marshall Herff Applewhite have had over the hearts and minds of their followers. Let us focus on the Jonestown Massacre described in Chapter 1. How could a single individual have such power that, at his command, hundreds of people would kill their own children and themselves? The tragedy at Jonestown is too complex to be understood fully by a single explanation. But one clue does emanate from the foot-in-the-door phenomenon discussed earlier. Jim Jones extracted his followers' trust in him one step at a time. Indeed, close scrutiny reveals a chain of ever-increasing commitments on the part of his followers. Let us start at the beginning. It is easy to understand how a charismatic leader like Jones might extract money from the members of his church. Once they have committed themselves to donating a small amount of money in response to his message of peace and universal brotherhood, they have stepped off the pyramid in his direction, and will feel the need to justify their decision to give him money. Therefore, he is able to request and receive more. Next, he induces people to sell their homes and turn over the money to the church. Soon, at his request, several of his followers pull up stakes, leaving their families and friends, and start life anew in the strange and difficult environment of Guyana. There, not only do they work hard, but they also are cut off from potential dissenting opinion, inasmuch as they are surrounded by true believers. Then Jones begins to take sexual liberties with several married women among his followers, who acquiesce, if reluctantly. Finally, as a prelude to the climactic event, Jones induces his followers to perform a series of mock ritual suicides as a test of their loyalty and obedience. Thus, in a step-by-step fashion, the members' commitment to Jim Jones increases. Each step in itself is not a huge leap from the one preceding it, but the last step is a far cry from the first one. Dissonance on the world stage. Dissonance in our everyday lives is mostly benign, helping us get along with our decisions and choices with a minimum of misery or regrets. But, as the Jonestown story shows, it is impossible to overstate the potential dangers posed by our susceptibility to the need to reduce dissonance. Suppose a madman has taken over your country and has decided to eradicate all members of your religious group. But you don't know that for sure. What you do know is that your country is being occupied, that the leader of the occupation forces does not like your religious group, and that occasionally members of your faith are forced to move from their homes and are kept in detention camps. What do? You could try to flee your country, you could try to pass as a member of a different religious group, or you could sit tight and hope for the best. Each of these options is extremely dangerous. It is difficult to escape or to pass and go undetected, and if you are caught trying to flee or disguising your identity, the penalty is immediate execution. Yet deciding to sit tight could be disastrous if it turns out that your religious group is being systematically annihilated. Let us suppose you commit yourself to sitting tight, turning your back on opportunities to try either to escape or to pass. Such a life-or-death decision naturally produces a great deal of dissonance. To reduce dissonance, you convince yourself that you made a wise decision, that although people of your religious sect are made to move and are being treated unfairly, they are not being killed unless they break the law. This position is not difficult to maintain because there is no unambiguous evidence to the contrary. Suppose that, months later, a respected man from your town tells you that, while hiding in the forest, he witnessed soldiers butchering all the men, women, and children who had recently been deported from the town. I predict that you would try to dismiss this information as untrue. You would convince yourself that the reporter was lying or hallucinating. If you had listened to the man who tried to warn you, you might have escaped. Instead, you and your family are slaughtered. Fantastic? Impossible? How could anyone not take the respected man seriously? Yet the events I just described are an accurate account of what happened in 1944 to the Jews in Siyet, Hungary. 70. The processes of cognitive distortion and selective exposure to information have been crucial factors in the wars in Vietnam and Iraq. In a thought-provoking analysis of the Pentagon Papers, a secret Department of Defense study of American political and military involvement in Vietnam that was eventually leaked to the public, Ralph White showed how dissonance blinded our leaders to information incompatible with the decisions they had already made. As White put it, there was a tendency, when actions were out of line with ideas, for decision-makers to align their ideas with their actions. Lyndon Johnson's decision to continue to escalate the bombing of North Vietnam was made at the price of ignoring crucial evidence from the CIA and other sources that bombing would not break the will of the North Vietnamese people but, quite the contrary, would only strengthen their resolve. White wrote, "It is instructive, for instance, to compare McNamara's highly factual evidence-oriented summary of the case against bombing in 1966. With the Joint Chiefs memorandum that disputed his conclusion and called the bombing one of our two trump cards, while it apparently ignored all of the facts that showed the opposite. Yet it was the Joint Chiefs who prevailed. 71. Presidents of both political parties have overlooked evidence they didn't want to accept. Lyndon Johnson did so in the Vietnam War, George W. Bush did so in the Iraq War. In 2003, Bush wanted to believe that Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction that posed a threat to Americans. This led him and his advisors to interpret the information in CIA reports as definitive proof of Iraq's WMDs, even though the reports were ambiguous and contradicted by other evidence. President Bush's interpretation provided the justification to launch a preemptive war. He was convinced that once our troops entered Iraq they would find these weapons. 72. After the invasion of Iraq, when asked where are the WMDs, administration officials said that Iraq is a big country in which the WMDs were well hidden, but asserted that the weapons would be found. As the months dragged on and still no WMDs were found, the officials continued to assert that they would be uncovered. Why? Because the administration officials were experiencing enormous dissonance. They had to believe they would find the WMDs to justify the decision to start a war, otherwise, Iraq had posed no immediate threat to the United States. Finally, officials concluded that there were no such weapons. Even George Bush finally admitted it in his memoir. 73. Now what? American soldiers and Iraqi civilians were dying every week, and hundreds of billions of dollars were being drained from the U.S. Treasury. How did President Bush and his staff reduce dissonance? They did so by adding new cognitions to justify the war. Suddenly, we learned that the U.S. mission was to liberate the nation from a cruel dictator and bestow upon the Iraqi people the blessings of democratic institutions. To a neutral observer, that justification was inadequate. But to Bush and his advisors, who had been experiencing dissonance, the justification seemed reasonable, indeed essential. Many of Bush's critics believed that he was deliberately trying to deceive the American people. We cannot be certain what was going on in the president's mind, but what we do know, based on more than 50 years of research on cognitive dissonance, is that he and his advisors succeeded in deceiving themselves. They convinced themselves that invading Iraq was worthwhile even in the absence of WMDs. 74. How can a leader avoid falling into the self-justification trap? Historical examples show us that the way out of this process is for a leader to bring in skilled advisors from outside his or her inner circle, because the advisors will not be caught up in the need to reduce the dissonance created by the leader's earlier decisions. As the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin 75 pointed out, it was precisely for this reason that Abraham Lincoln chose a cabinet that included several people who disagreed with his policies about how best to end slavery. Let's return to the Vietnam War for a moment. Why did the Joint Chiefs make the ill-advised decision to increase the bombing, escalating a war that was unwinnable? They were staying the course, justifying earlier actions with identical or even more extreme ones. Escalation of this sort is self-perpetuating. From Jonestown to war, once a small commitment is made, the stage is set for ever-increasing commitments. The behavior needs to be justified, so attitudes are changed. This change in attitudes influences future decisions and behavior. It's the large-scale version of the foot-in-the-door technique, but at a life-and-death level of importance. Once a European Jew had decided not to pass and allowed himself to be identified as a Jew, the decision was irrevocable. He could not easily pretend to be a Gentile. Once Pentagon officials intensified the bombing of North Vietnam, they could not undo it. The flavor of this kind of cognitive escalation is nicely captured in an analysis of the Pentagon Papers by the editors of Time magazine. Yet the bureaucracy, the Pentagon Papers indicate, always demanded new options. Each option was to apply more force. Each tightening of the screw created a position that must be defended. Once committed, the military pressure must be maintained. 76. Living with the rationalizer within. Why is it so hard to apologize when we make a big mistake or hurt a friend, and mean it? Dissonance theory provides the answer, because we don't really mean it. We are so busy justifying our actions that we privately feel we did nothing wrong at all. The other person started this. The other person insulted me. The other person made me cheat. Yeah, what I did wasn't so great, but the other guy's behavior was way worse. That's why, when people are forced to apologize, what they say usually rings hollow. If I offended anyone. Of course you did. That's why we want you to apologize. Only by stepping back and recognizing how prone we are to rationalizing and justifying ourselves can we take the first step to being able to apologize and really mean it, and thereby maintain healthy relationships. Near the beginning of this chapter, I made the point that people are capable of rational, adaptive behavior, as well as dissonance-reducing behavior. Let's return to that issue. If individuals concentrate their time and effort on protecting their egos, they will never grow. To grow, we must learn from our mistakes. But if we are intent on reducing dissonance, we will not admit to our mistakes. Instead, we will sweep them under the rug or, worse still, turn them into virtues. The memoirs of presidents are full of the kind of self-serving, self-justifying statements that are best summarized in the words of former President Lyndon Johnson, who escalated the war in Vietnam with disastrous consequences for both countries. If I had it all to do over again, would not change a thing. 77. On the other hand, people do frequently grow and learn from their mistakes. How? Under what conditions? Ideally, when I make a mistake, I should look at what I did in a non-defensive manner and, in effect, say to myself, okay, I blew it. What can I learn from the experience so that I will not end up in this position again? I can increase the probability of being able to do this in the following ways. Through a greater understanding of my own defensiveness and dissonance-reducing tendencies. Through the realization that doing something foolish, immoral, or hurtful does not necessarily mean that I am an irrevocably foolish, immoral, or cruel person. Cheating on one occasion doesn't inevitably make me a cheater, unless I keep justifying what I did. Through the development of enough ego strength to acknowledge and learn from errors in myself. Of course, it is far easier to list these procedures than it is to accomplish them. How do we get in touch with our defensiveness and dissonance-reducing tendencies? How can we come to realize that good people like ourselves can occasionally do something at work or in love that is misguided or immoral? It is not enough to understand dissonance abstractly or superficially, to fully use this knowledge. A person must consciously practice it. We will take a closer look at this process in Chapter 8, where we will examine the advantage of authenticity and non-defensive communication in our relationships. For conformity. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Originally published in The New Yorker, April 24, 1965. Suddenly somebody began to run. It may be that he had simply remembered, all of a moment, an engagement to meet his wife, for which he was now frightfully late. Whatever it was, he ran east on Broad Street. Somebody else began to run, perhaps a newsboy in high spirits. Another man, a portly gentleman of affairs, broke into a trot. Inside of 10 minutes, everybody on High Street, from the Union Depot to the courthouse, was running. A loud mumble gradually crystallized into the dread word damn. The dam has broke. The fear was put into words by a little old lady in an electric car, or by a traffic cop, or by a small boy, nobody knows who, nor does it now really matter. 2,000 people were abruptly in full flight. Go east, was the cry that arose east, away from the river, east to safety. Go east. Go east. A tall spare woman with grim eyes and a determined chin ran past me down the middle of the street. I was still uncertain as to what was the matter, in spite of all the shouting. I drew up alongside the woman with some effort, for although she was in her late 50s, She had a beautiful, easy running form and seemed to be in excellent condition. "What is it?" I puffed. She gave a quick glance and then looked ahead again, stepping up her pace a trifle. "Don't ask me, ask God," she said. Although comical, this story from the great humorist James Thurber's autobiography is an apt illustration of people conforming. One or two individuals begin running for their own reasons. Before long, everyone is running. Why? Because others are running. In Thurber's story, when the runners realized that the dam hadn't broken after all, they felt pretty foolish. And yet how much more foolish would they have felt if they hadn't conformed and the dam had actually burst? Is conformity good or bad? In its simplest sense, this is an absurd question. Still, words carry evaluative meaning. Thus, in American culture, to be called an individualist or a nonconformist evokes an image of a lone cowboy standing on a mountaintop with a rifle slung over his shoulder, the breeze blowing through his hair as the sun sets in the background. To call someone in this culture a conformist is an insult. The term evokes an image of a person who mindlessly follows others, business executives in formal suits, teenagers adopting the dress, talk, and mannerisms of their friends, people coming to believe some doomsday prediction or conspiracy theory because everyone they know does. Everyone can summon an image of a conformist, and it is rarely a flattering one. One consequence of the fact that we are social animals is that we live in a state of tension between values associated with individuality and values associated with conformity. We have synonyms for these words that bring to mind very different images. For individualist or nonconformist we can substitute the word deviant, for conformist we can say team player. Somehow, deviant no longer evokes the lone cowboy, likewise, team player doesn't suggest the conforming white-collar worker, teenager, or conspiracy theorist. Our culture is likewise ambivalent about conformity and nonconformity. For example, one of the bestsellers of the 1950s was a book by John F. Kennedy, called Profiles in Courage, in which he praised several politicians for their courage in resisting political pressure to conform. To put it another way, Kennedy was praising deviant and bad team players who lacked the ability to harmonize with their parties or constituents. These nonconformists earned Kennedy's praise, but at the time of their actions, their colleagues were generally far from pleased. Indeed, most were angry at what they saw as betrayal and failing to follow party line. Nonconformists make for interesting stories precisely because they are frequently treated so badly by the people around them. As much as we may admire them in history or in movies, in our daily transactions we tend to prefer the conformist. This observation receives strong support from a number of classic experiments in social psychology. In one by Stanley Schachter, groups of male students met to discuss the case history and decide the fate of a teenager who had been arrested for breaking the law. After reading the case, each group was asked to discuss it and to come to an agreement regarding the young man's punishment on a scale ranging from very lenient treatment to very harsh treatment. A typical group consisted of 9 participants, 6 of whom were genuine and 3 of whom were paid confederates of the experimenter. The confederates took turns playing one of 3 roles that they had carefully rehearsed in advance: the modal person, who took a position that conformed to the average position of the real participants; the deviant, who took a position diametrically opposed to the general orientation of the group; and the slider, whose initial position was similar to the deviant's but who, in the course of the discussion, gradually slid into a modal, conforming position. Which participant do you think was most liked? The rebel? Not at all. It was the man who conformed most to the group norm. The deviant was liked least. Moreover, patterns of communication changed predictably. Early on in the discussion, the group spent considerable time trying to talk the deviant into accepting their point of view. But when it became clear the deviant wouldn't budge, the others largely ignored him, essentially cutting him out of the group discussion. In a follow-up experiment, Ari Kruglansky and Donna Webster found that nonconformists are especially disliked if they voice their dissent near a deadline, when groups are feeling the pinch to come to closure, than if they voice dissent earlier in the discussion. Thus, the data indicate that at least in decision-making groups, we tend to like conformists better than nonconformists. This preference is not irrational. The inclination to harmonize with others by sacrificing personal wishes conferred a tremendous evolutionary advantage for our species. Our ability to work in teams and transmit culture allowed humans to thrive. We can laugh at Thurber's mob running from a flood that wasn't, but we should also marvel at the mechanism at work. Like a flock of birds in the park, startling a single bird will spread quickly and the entire flock flies away. That conformist reflex was undoubtedly crucial in our hunter-gatherer past. Indeed, nonconformity can be disastrous. Suppose I suddenly decide I am fed up with being a conformist. So I hop in my car and start driving down the left-hand side of the road, not a terribly smart or adaptive way of expressing my rugged individualism and not very fair to you if you happen to be driving toward me on the same street. Yet as adaptive as our conformist nature can be, history is marked by events in which the tendency to do as others do leads to tragedy, from post-game riots at soccer matches to Adolf Hitler's throngs of fanatics shouting, Sieg Heil, in unison. But conformity occurs not only in mindless crowds but also among close-knit groups, whose members ought to know better. In his memoirs, Albert Speer, one of Hitler's top advisors, described the circle around Hitler as one of total conformity. Deviation was not permitted. In such an atmosphere, even the most barbarous activities seemed reasonable because the absence of dissent, which conveyed the illusion of unanimity, prevented any one advisor from entertaining the possibility that other options might exist. Speer wrote, "In normal circumstances, people who turn their backs on reality are soon set straight by the mockery and criticism of those around them. In the Third Reich there were not such correctives. On the contrary, every self-deception was multiplied as in a hall of distorting mirrors, becoming a repeatedly confirmed picture of a fantastical dream world, which no longer bore any relationship to the grim outside world. In those mirrors I could see nothing but my own face reproduced many times over." Closer to home, consider the White House staffers and top-level advisors involved with former President Richard Nixon in the Watergate cover-up. Here, men in high government office, many of whom were attorneys, perjured themselves, destroyed evidence, and offered bribes without an apparent second thought. This was due, at least in part, to the closed circle of single-mindedness that surrounded the president in the early 1970s. This single-mindedness made deviation virtually unthinkable until the circle had been broken. Once it was, several high-ranking advisors seemed to view their illegal behavior with astonishment, as if it were performed during some sort of bad dream. Nixon's White House lawyer, John Dean, put it this way. "When you picked up the newspaper in the morning and read the new cover story that had replaced yesterday's cover story, you began to believe that today's news was the truth. This process created an atmosphere of unreality in the White House that prevailed to the very end. If you said it often enough, it would become true. When the press learned of the wiretaps on newsmen and White House staffers, for example, and flat denials failed, it was claimed that this was a national security matter. I'm sure many people believed that the taps were for national security. They weren't. That was concocted as a justification after the fact. But when they said it, you understand, they really believed it. Sometimes the need to conform will even silence an individual's certain knowledge of a forthcoming disaster." On January 28, 1986, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded a few seconds after lifting off. 7 astronauts, including a much-beloved schoolteacher named Krista McAuliffe, perished in a fireball of smoke and flames. Somehow the decision had been made to go ahead with the launch despite strenuous objections and warnings from engineers about defective O-rings at the joints of the booster rockets. The administrators at the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, who made the ultimate decision to launch, were neither ignorant of the danger or cavalier about the lives of the astronauts. Nor were the makers of the defective booster rockets. Yet, amid the pressures for NASA to go forward with the highly anticipated launch, decision-makers with dissenting opinions, which turned out to be correct, were either converted to the majority position or were excluded from the conversation altogether, much like the deviants in Stanley Schachter's experiment. Let's take stock. What do Hitler's inner circle, Nixon's close advisors, and NASA administrators have in common, aside from the fact that they made terrible decisions? Each was a relatively cohesive group isolated from dissenting points of view. When such groups are called upon to make decisions, they can fall prey to what Irving Janis called groupthink, a way of thinking that occurs in cohesive groups in which the members' need for agreement overrides their ability to realistically assess a course of action and its alternatives. Groups engaging in this maladaptive decision-making strategy typically perceive themselves as invulnerable. They're blinded by optimism. And this optimism grows when dissent is discouraged. In the face of conformity pressures, group members may come to doubt their own reservations and refrain from voicing them, much like our hypothetical friend Sam from Chapter 1, who concealed his true opinions after learning that his debate-watching companions unanimously disagreed with him. Groupthink. A kind of thinking in which maintaining group agreement overrides a careful consideration of the facts in a realistic manner. By citing these examples, I do not mean to suggest that individuals who make bad decisions should be let off the hook because conformity comes naturally to humans. Rather, I am arguing that it is vital to appreciate the power and the psychological workings of conformity, so that we might reduce it when it is maladaptive, when the crowd is wrong. It is only through digging deeper and trying to understand these processes that we can have any hope of improving the way people make decisions and reducing the frequency of future calamities. What is conformity? Conformity can be defined as a change in a person's behavior or opinions as a result of real or imagined pressure from another person or group of people. As evolutionary theory would predict, it begins early, in infancy, and has neurological underpinnings. Conformity. Changes in a person's behavior or opinions as a result of real or imagined pressure from a person or a group of people. The biology of conformity. You can appreciate how fundamental conformity is to our species by looking at how early in life we start to copy one another. Although we are not born mimics, babies learn early through social interaction to respond in kind to the faces in front of them, and, indeed, will often pay more attention to a face that mirrors their own facial expressions than to one that does not. When people talk to each other, they often mirror one another's nonverbal behaviors and mannerisms, a phenomenon called the chameleon effect. Tanya Chartrand and John Barg 10 had students discuss a set of photographs with a Confederate who, at regular points during the interaction, either touched his face or shook his foot. Students paired with the face-touching partner touched their own faces significantly more often during the interaction. Those paired with the foot-shaking partner were more likely to shake their own foot. In another session, the Confederates either subtly mirrored the posture and mannerisms of the study participant, for example, by crossing their legs, touching their faces, or fiddling with their hair, or they did not. After this interaction, participants rated their partners, liking the chameleons more than the non-chameleons. This finding suggests that we mimic others because doing so both reflects and engenders feelings of closeness, creating a sort of social glue. 11 people who are especially skilled at changing their perspective, seeing the world through other people's eyes, are better chameleons, and thus better liked. 12 But mimicry has to be done naturally. Intentional efforts to mimic other people in order to win favor can backfire. 13 It did for Hillary Clinton, who was criticized for adopting a Southern drawl when she campaigned in the South. 14 Although many animals imitate others of their kind, humans are exceptionally prone to it. Some neuroscientists attribute this fact to mirror neurons, highly specialized brain cells that are activated both when we perform an action and when we witness another person performing the same action. Think of how you cringe when you see a comedian bombing on stage, or wince when witnessing another's pain. Mirror neurons enable empathy but certainly do not guarantee it. They turn off when people are looking at individuals they dislike or who have less power and status than they do. 15 One of the major functions of the mirror system is that it facilitates social learning, the process by which we learn by observing. Experiments led by Daniel Hound 16 found that toddlers will copy the behaviors of their peers, even if it means ignoring prior learning and losing a reward. Toddlers in one study were given a ball and puzzle box with 3 ball-sized holes in it, and they learned quickly that putting the ball in a specific hole earned them a piece of chocolate. After this learning phase, each child joined a group of other toddlers who had learned to get their chocolate by dropping their ball into a different hole, e.g., the left one. During this second phase, the toddlers continued getting chocolate for putting the ball into the same hole as before, but many tended to conform to their peers instead, abandoning their learning, and the chocolate, in favor of conforming to the children who had learned a slightly different rule. When the same experiment was conducted with chimps and orangutans, also highly social animals, they did not show these conformist tendencies. They stuck with the behavior that maximized their own rewards. Once again we see how, in humans, the impulse to conform can trump a personal preference, even for chocolate. Social learning. The process by which we learn social behavior by observing others. Subtle influences on conformity. Most acts of conformity occur without any sense that pressure is being applied. For example, laugh tracks on television comedies are so ubiquitous that we scarcely notice them, yet the information they convey, that other people find something funny, profoundly influences our own response to that same something. In 1984, in a famous episode in American politics, the 73-year-old president, Ronald Reagan, was facing difficulties in his bid for re-election. Already the oldest president in American history, there was widespread concern that Reagan was too old for the demands of the job. His much younger opponent, Walter Mondale, had been vice president and a popular senator. He had experience, as well as youth and vigor. Yet Reagan defeated Mondale in a landslide. How did Reagan reassure voters and win so decisively? Partly, with humor, notably, a zinger he delivered during their second debate, when asked if he might not be too old to be president. "I will not make age an issue in this campaign," Reagan said. "I'm not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience." The audience, including Mondale, laughed and applauded at Reagan's ironic wit, and many voters changed their mind about Reagan at that moment, apparently reassured by this and other rehearsed jokes that he was still mentally fit to serve. Many years later, in a clever experiment, Stephen Fine and his colleague 17 played tapes of the famous debate to college students who had never heard of it or seen it before. In a baseline condition, they presented the debate just as people saw it in 1984. In a second condition, he removed two of Reagan's most humorous lines, including the age and inexperience joke. In the third condition, he left the funny lines in but removed the audience laughter and applause. After watching, participants rated their liking for both candidates and assessed who had done a better job in the debate. Both changes to the original tape made a difference. Eliminating Reagan's jokes altogether was enough to completely erase the perception that Reagan won the debate. But it wasn't the jokes by themselves that were crucial. When observers heard Reagan's jokes without the audience reaction, most of them thought Mondale won. With the laughter included, they thought Reagan won. No direct pressure was needed, just other people laughing. A good deal of conformity proceeds this way. Social cues in the environment tell us what others are feeling or thinking or doing, which in turn influences what we feel and think and do. Let's return to our friend Sam, the hypothetical college student. Recall that Sam was watching a senatorial candidate on television and was favorably impressed by her sincerity. However, the unanimous opinion of his friends that the candidate was insincere put a lot of social pressure on him, and he acceded, verbally, at least, to their opinion. Even this little story raises interesting questions. What causes people to conform to group pressure? Specifically, what's in it for Sam? What was the nature of the group pressure? Specifically, what were Sam's acquaintances doing to induce conformity? Did Sam revise his opinion of the candidate during that brief but unsettling period when he learned that all his fellow students disagreed with him? Or did Sam hang on to his original opinion and only modify what he said about the candidate? If he changed his opinion, was it permanent or just for that evening? Unfortunately, because Sam is a hypothetical character, we are unable to ask him. Moreover, it's doubtful that even a flesh and blood Sam could give us an accurate accounting, because not only are humans limited in their ability to explain their own behavior with much accuracy, 18 there are simply too many factors in this situation. We don't know how confident Sam was in his initial opinion. We don't know how well he knew or how much he liked the people with whom he watched the candidate's speech. We don't know whether Sam considers himself to be a good judge of sincerity or whether he considers the others to be good judges of sincerity. We don't know whether Sam is generally a strong person or a wishy-washy person, nor do we know how much willpower Sam has left after a day of studying, and so on. What we can do is conduct experiments in which people face dilemmas like Sam's and where we have the ability to control and vary the factors we think might influence conformity. A great many studies in social psychology have done this, beginning with early research by Muzaffar Sharif and Solomon Asch. Sharif's and Asch's classic experiments: if you are in a dark room and you stare at a fixed point of light from a distance, after a while the light will appear to move, a visual illusion called the autokinetic effect. Muzaffar Sharif 19 harnessed this illusion to study how perceptions are socially influenced. He had college students sit in a dark room, watch a point of light, and then, each time it moved, report how far. Each student did this alone for several trials, and after several trials, settled on a reliable distance, usually between 2 to 6 inches. Then they were put in the dark room in small groups and asked to repeat the task, this time reporting their estimates out loud. Sharif noticed a strong effect of the presence of others. Nearly everyone's own judgments started to move in the direction of the group average. For example, if I typically saw the light move 2 inches when I was on my own, but my groupmates tended to see it move 6 inches, I would now start reporting around 4 inches of movement. Likewise, those who originally saw more movement would report seeing less after hearing my opinion. What's more, the change stuck. After being exposed to a group's opinions, members were tested again, and their answers continued to reflect the group's influence on their own judgments. Sharif later found that he could reliably shape the group norm by having his confederates give arbitrary estimates. So long as the deviation from the actual norm wasn't too large, he could steer the group in whichever direction he wanted. Estimating how much a point of light is moving has a built-in ambiguity. Some years later, Solomon Asch wanted to see what would happen when the object of judgment was unambiguous. 20 What if you were judging not an optical illusion but an obvious fact right in front of your eyes? Asch predicted that conformity would plummet. Put yourself in the following situation: you have volunteered to participate in an experiment on perceptual judgment. You enter a room with 6 other participants. The experimenter shows all of you a straight line next to 3 other lines for comparison. Your job is to judge which of the 3 lines is closest in length to line X. The judgment strikes you as being ridiculously easy. It is perfectly apparent to you that line B is the correct answer, and when your turn comes, you will say that B is the one. But it's not your turn. You are second to last. The young man whose turn it is looks carefully at the lines and says, "Line A." Your mouth drops open and you look at him quizzically. How can he believe it's A when any fool can see that it's B, you ask yourself. He must be either blind or crazy. Now it's the second person's turn to respond. He also chooses line A. You begin to feel like Alice in Wonderland. How can it be, you ask yourself. Are both of these people blind or crazy? But then the next person responds, and he also says, line A. You take another look at those lines. Maybe I'm the only one who's crazy, you mutter inaudibly. Now it's the 5th person's turn, and he also judges the correct line to be A. Finally, it's your turn. Why, it's line A, of course, you declare. I knew it all the time. This is the conflict that Asch created in his experiment. As you might have guessed, the individuals who preceded you were in his employ and had been instructed to agree on an incorrect answer. The perceptual judgment itself was incredibly easy. When people were asked to judge the lines when they were alone, they made almost no errors. Indeed, the task was so easy, and the correct line was so obvious, that Asch himself firmly believed that there would be little, if any, yielding to group pressure. But his prediction was wrong. When faced with the fact of all of their fellow students agreeing on the same incorrect responses in a series of 12 judgments, approximately 3/4 of the participants conformed at least once by responding incorrectly. Over the entire spectrum of judgments, an average of 35% conformed to the incorrect judgments. Asch performed his experiments in the middle of the 20th century. Although the results were powerful, it is tempting to dismiss his findings on the grounds that American college students are different now. With the advent of computers and the internet, you might think we have grown more sophisticated and therefore much less susceptible to this kind of group pressure. Not so. Over the years, the ash experiment has been successfully replicated many times. In an especially striking demonstration on national television, Anthony Pratkani's 21 repeated the experiment precisely as Ash had run it 50 years earlier. The participants in this replication were also college students, many of whom considered themselves nonconformists. The results were almost identical to Ash's. However, there are some cultural differences in the tendency to go against the group. One is nicely illustrated by this contrast in folk wisdom. In America, people say, "The squeaky wheel gets the grease." In Japan they say, "The nail that sticks up gets pounded down." In their analysis of 133 experiments using the ash procedure in 17 different countries, Rod Bond and Peter Smith 22 found that conformity is more prevalent in collectivist societies, which explicitly value group harmony, than in individualistic societies. Nevertheless, for human beings anywhere, resisting group pressure is very difficult, and the pain of nonconformity shows up not only on their faces but also in their neurological activity. Gregory Burns and his associates 23 replicated Ash's procedures while monitoring participants' neural activity with functional magnetic resonance imaging. These scans indicated a major difference between participants who resisted group pressure and those who yielded. Those who resisted showed heightened activity in the amygdala, a region of the brain associated with pain, fear, and emotional discomfort, showing that going against the group induces neural signals of physical pain. 24 Just as we saw that social rejection does. 25. The situation created by these experiments is especially intriguing because, unlike many situations in which we tend to conform, there were no explicit constraints against individuality. More often, the sanctions against nonconformity are unequivocal. For example, I have always hated to wear ties, and the world has finally caught up with me. Nowadays ties are rarely required. But in the 1960s, when I was a young professor, dress codes were more formal. This meant that if I went out for an evening celebration at a fancy restaurant, the maitre d' would politely inform me that if I didn't put on the tie they offered, then no table. So I could put on the tie and eat in the restaurant, or I could leave, open-necked and comfortable but hungry. In this case, as in many others, the negative consequences of nonconformity are made explicit. Likewise, Janis found in his studies of groupthink that one or two people typically step forward to enforce the norms of the group. These self-appointed mind guards, as Janis called them, encourage conformity and consensus. Much like the maitre d' in the restaurant, mind guards make it clear that if you want to be included, you'll need to comply with the norms of the group. But in Ash's experiment and in the case of Sam and his friends, the situations were much more subtle. In these situations, there were no explicit rewards for conformity, no explicit punishments for deviance, and no mind guards prodding deviance toward agreement, just people reporting what they saw in a matter-of-fact way. Why, then, did Ash's participants conform? Motives for conformity, belonging versus getting information. There are two primary reasons for conformity: because other people are sources of valuable information, or because being too different from others is uncomfortable, and conformity secures our place within a group by signaling our similarity and ideological kinship. The former reason is informative. People become convinced in the face of the unanimous majority that their own opinions are wrong for some reason. The other is normative. People go along with the crowd, while inwardly believing their initial judgments are correct, in order to be accepted by the majority or to avoid being disliked by them for disagreeing. The behavior of the individuals in Ash's experiment, and in others where judgments are straightforward, seem to be largely a matter of going along to avoid the sense of exclusion. We can infer this from the fact that everyone gave their honest opinion about the line match when they were allowed to respond privately. At the same time, in many situations we conform to the behavior of others because as physical reality becomes increasingly uncertain, people rely more and more on social reality. 26 That is, other people's behavior is the best available guide to understanding what's going on. In such cases, conformity is especially likely to result in shaping our opinions and perception of reality, as with students in Sharif's experiments and in the scene recalled by Thurber at the beginning of this chapter. If other people are doing it, it must be the right thing to do. An example should clarify this distinction between normative and informative conformity. Years ago, I was in an unfamiliar building when I needed to use the toilet. Following the sign for restrooms, I found the usual 2 doors, but someone had removed the specific designations, so I could not distinguish the men's room from the women's. Quite a dilemma. I didn't dare guess for fear of entering the women's bathroom and being embarrassed, or embarrassing any woman who was in there. As I stood waiting in discomfort, hopping from one foot to the other, the door on my left opened and out strolled a guy. With a sigh of relief, I went in, conforming because I had the right information. Much of the time, other people are an excellent source of information, and conforming satisfies our needs for both accuracy and belonging. Phoning your mother on Mother's Day, going with your friends to work at a homeless shelter at Thanksgiving, and studying hard to do well on an exam are all things that people do and that are right to do. Sometimes, however, we are like the students in Ash's experiment. Our need to be right is in conflict with our need to belong. If you were a participant in that experiment and you initially believed that the correct answer was line B, then saying so might satisfy your desire to be correct, but it might also violate the expectations of your peers, and they might think you odd. Choosing line A might win you the acceptance of the others, but unless you became convinced that they were correct, it would violate your desire to be right. This fundamental predicament, between being right or trying to please the group, lies at the heart of some of our greatest failings. Every year in Joshua's social psychology class, students write anonymously about their most regrettable acts of conformity, acts they would undo if they could travel back in time. Year after year, a striking number of students confess to having bullied, teased, or humiliated another person, for no reason other than the implied or actual approval of their peers. I knew I was destroying this kid. One student wrote, describing having mercilessly teased a funny-looking boy one night at summer camp. I could hear him trying not to cry. He was lying a couple of bunks away from me, in the dark, pleading for us to stop calling him the name we'd given him, Monk, short for monkey. But I just kept going, egged on by the laughter. I can still hear it, them giggling while I ruined this poor kid's life. I've never forgiven myself for that. Another student regretted refusing to speak to his mother for a month in the 8th grade after she'd tried to save money by getting a less expensive shirt without the Abercrombie logo prized by 8th graders at the time. I can't believe how much I hated my mom for that, he wrote. The absence of a little moose on my shirt, and I wanted to kill her. Another student regretted witnessing a murder and never telling the police. In my neighborhood we just didn't talk to the police, he said. That was the norm. Despite what social psychology students say when prompted to recall past acts of conformity, most of us believe that we are motivated primarily by a desire to be correct, whereas others are motivated primarily by a desire to please the group. When people unobtrusively observe an Ash-like conformity experiment, they typically underestimate how much they would conform and overestimate how often others will. 27. As we have seen, sometimes conformity is induced by fear of violating norms, other times by information that clarifies ambiguity. But it is not always easy to distinguish between them. Often the conforming behavior is identical. The key element that differentiates them is the presence or absence of a punitive agent. Imagine that, in the mythical nation of Fredonia, it is considered gracious for guests to belch after eating, as a way of showing the host that they enjoyed the meal. Suppose you didn't know this, and you were visiting the home of a Fredonian dignitary in the company of some diplomats from the U.S. State Department. If, after the meal, these diplomats began to belch, chances are you would belch, also. They are providing you with valuable information. Conform to belching to do the right thing. But suppose you were in the same home in the company of some rude and brawny young men who were introduced to you as members of the Fredonian Olympic heavyweight wrestling team. If these behemoths belched after their meal, you might not go along. You would probably consider this an act of bad manners. However, if they glared at you for your failure to follow suit, you might indeed belch, too, not because of the information they supplied but because you feared rejection or even a broken nose for refusing to be a good sport by going along with their boorish behavior. Conformity resulting from the observation of others for the purpose of gaining information about proper behavior tends to have more powerful ramifications than conformity in the interest of being accepted or of avoiding punishment. I would argue that, if we find ourselves in an ambiguous situation where we must use the behavior of other people as a template for our own behavior, we are likely to repeat our newly learned behavior, without a cue, on subsequent similar occasions. This would be the case unless, of course, we later received evidence that our actions had been inappropriate or incorrect. Thus, now suppose you are invited back to the home of the Fredonian dignitary for dinner, but this time you are the only guest. The question is, do you or don't you belch after the meal? If you had belched after the first meal at his home because you realized it was the proper thing to do, you would be quite likely to belch when dining alone with the dignitary. However, if you had belched the first time out of fear of rejection or punishment, you would almost certainly not belch when you are the lone guest. Factors that increase or decrease conformity. What about Sam? Was he convinced by his fellow college students that his preferred senatorial candidate was a phony, or did he simply go along with their judgment in order to be accepted? To answer such questions, it's helpful to consider the factors that influence conformity and that can also be used to prevent groupthink. The prestige and prevalence of models. When we are unclear about what is going on in a situation, we are particularly likely to conform to people whose behavior provides the most reliable information. Say you live in a town where jaywalking is rare and frowned upon, but you really want to save a few seconds by crossing in the middle of a busy road. Field experiments show that you are more likely to do it if you follow a jaywalker who is well dressed rather than poorly dressed. 28. On a broader level, popular writer Malcolm Gladwell 29 suggests that major social trends often change dramatically and suddenly through the mechanism of conformity when respected and well-connected people happen to be in the right place at the right time. When a video goes viral, a trend becomes epidemic, or a brand of shoes all of a sudden becomes the must-have item of apparel, it is often because of one or two individuals who are connected to vast social networks. They begin wearing the cool new thing, which leads others to crave the cool new thing, and soon a critical mass or tipping point is reached and the trend explodes. Influential people needn't be experts, they are simply people who seem to be in the know, or who, like the Kardashians, are famous for being famous. Nowadays, of course, the big connectors are people whose tweets or social media posts reach massive audiences, many of whom may retweet or repost them through their networks, who in turn retweet them through theirs. When large numbers of people are doing something, it is especially informative. Where should I eat? Log on to Yelp to see what the crowd thinks. What should I read? See what's trending on Amazon. Which food truck is the best? I'll bet on the one with the longest line of customers. So long as the crowd's judgments are independent from one another, as with the collection of strangers who submit reviews to Yelp, the crowd can provide a far better estimate of what is true and good than our own private guesses. 30. Unanimity in face-to-face group situations, like the one investigated by Ash, one of the crucial factors that determines whether a person will conform is whether everyone else shares an opinion. The actual number of people in that everyone else group need not be very high to elicit maximum conformity. People will conform to group pressure about as often when the unanimous group consists of only 3 other people as when it consists of 16. But when unanimity is broken, so is the pressure to conform. Even a single ally who sees it your way releases you from that pressure. Conformity drops sharply in such cases. 31. In fact, even if the unanimity is broken by someone who gives a different wrong answer, the presence of a fellow dissenter sharply reduces conformity, and the participant is likely to give the correct response. Line B. It only takes one dissenter to seriously diminish the power of the group to induce conformity. 32. Commitment. Conformity to group pressure can also be decreased by inducing a person to make some sort of commitment to his or her initial judgment. Picture yourself as an umpire at a Major League Baseball game. There is a close play at first base and you call the runner out, in the presence of 50,000 fans. After the game, the 3 other umpires approach you, and each says that he thought the runner was safe. How likely are you to alter your judgment? Compare this with a situation in which each of the 3 umpires calls the runner safe and then it is your turn to make a judgment. Such a comparison was made in an experiment by Morton Deutsch and Harold Gerard, 33, using the Ash paradigm. They found that when participants had made no prior commitment to a line choice, some 25% of the responses conformed to the erroneous judgment of the majority. But when the individuals had publicly committed themselves before hearing the judgment of the other umpires, fewer than 6% of their new responses were conformist. Accountability. Suppose you're in a group problem-solving discussion and others are pressuring you to agree with their decision. In addition, suppose that you knew that, at the end of the meeting, you would need to justify your decision to the other members of the group. What effect do you think that might have on your thinking? Research has shown that under most conditions, this kind of accountability would increase your tendency to conform. Point 34. But what happens if you were also given instructions stressing the importance of being as accurate as possible? To answer that question, Andrew Quinn and Barry Schlenker 35 put people through a procedure aimed at producing conformity to a poor decision. Before the conformity aspect of the experiment began, the experimenters did two things. They got half of their participants thinking about the importance of being as accurate as possible, while getting the other half thinking about the importance of cooperation, and they told half of the participants in each of those two conditions that, after they made a decision, they would need to explain their reasoning to the group. The people who showed the most independence and made the best decisions were those who were oriented toward being accurate and had to explain their nonconformity to the very people whose influence they resisted. They behaved more independently than those who were oriented toward being accurate but were not held accountable. What this suggests is that most people will go along to get along, unless they know that they will be held accountable for a dumb, compliant decision. Self-esteem and security. Generally speaking, people who have low self-esteem are more likely to yield to group pressure than those with high self-esteem. 36. If they are led to believe that they have little or no aptitude for the task at hand, their tendency to conform increases. If they are given the opportunity to have prior success with a task, and thereby feel secure in their abilities, they are far less likely to conform than those who walk into the situation cold. Point 37. Similarly, how secure we feel in a given group determines how free we feel to deviate from its norms. If our friend Sam had felt sure that he was liked and accepted by the people watching the debate with him, he would have been more likely to voice disagreement than if he felt insecure in his relationship with them. To demonstrate this phenomenon, James Ditz and Harold Kelly 38 recruited college men to join a prestigious group and subsequently informed them that the members could remove any participant, at any time, in the interest of efficiency. The group then got into a discussion of juvenile offending. Periodically, the discussion was interrupted and each member was asked to rate every other member's value to the group. After the discussion, each member was shown how the others rated him. In actuality, the members were given prearranged false feedback. Some members were led to believe they were well liked and accepted, and others were led to believe they were not terribly popular. Each member's degree of conformity was measured by the opinions he subsequently expressed in further discussion and by his vulnerability to group pressure during the performance of a simple perceptual task. Those who were led to feel only moderately accepted were more likely to conform to the norms set by the others than were those who were led to feel totally accepted. Once we've earned a secure place in the group, we relax and express our opinions more freely. Age. As we have seen, even toddlers reflexively conform to what their peers are doing. This is how we learn many things, including our patterns of speech and accents. Point 39. But conformity pressures are most intense for young people between the ages of 10 and 25. Until then, the brain's self-control systems, which govern planning, thinking about the future, assessing risk, and suppressing impulses, are still developing. What adults have observed about adolescence since time immemorial turns out to be true. Teenagers become very different people in one another's company, often to their detriment and health. Compared to adult drivers, teenage drivers are more than 3 times as likely to be in an accident if passengers are in the car. 40. Lawrence Steinberg and his associates 41 found that young adults were more likely to interpret risky behaviors, running a red light, using drugs and alcohol, shoplifting, and so on, as exciting rather than dangerous if they were with their peers at the time. Pleasure centers in the brain are activated when peers are present, and without a fully developed prefrontal cortex to impose self-control, young people show a greater tendency to commit hazardous, foolish actions. As one expert on teen violence put it, the stupidest creature to ever walk the face of the earth is an adolescent boy in the company of his peers, 42 perhaps, but adolescent girls are not far behind. Abigail Baird, 43, has found that if a popular girl in an adolescent peer group expresses an opinion, even a crazy one, her peers will frequently find a way to talk themselves into agreeing with her position. In one study, teenage girls were asked if it was a good idea to go swimming in the ocean if a shark had been spotted in the area. Individually, all the girls were adamant in their thinking, no way would they go in. But in groups, when Baird had the dominant girl answer the question by suggesting that it could be an exciting adventure, the other girls would start agreeing with her, constructing rationalizations for swimming with sharks. The nature of the group A group is more effective at inducing conformity if it consists of perceived experts, its members are of high social status, or its members are alike in a significant way, such as age, occupation, political ideology, race, or ethnicity. Thus, Sam would be more likely to conform to the pressure exerted by his acquaintances if he thinks they are experts in politics and in making judgments about human sincerity. He would be more likely to yield to their views if they have higher status and he wants to be part of their circle. He would be more likely to conform to his fellow students than, say, to a group of 10-year-old children, a group of construction workers, or a group of Portuguese biochemists. Finally, he will be more likely to conform if he is in a racially homogeneous group than a racially diverse one. When white male college students were exposed to the unanimous judgments of 3 peers in an Ash-like judgment task, they were more conforming when all 3 peers were white than when a person of another race was in the group. You might anticipate a real-life benefit of that finding, namely, that racial diversity can discourage groupthink. Point 44. Groups that we belong to and identify with, our reference groups, both reflect and shape our identities and behaviors. Often, when we change reference groups, we change our behavior and attitudes as well in order to conform. For example, students who move to a new school or find new friendship groups within a school tend to become more like the group they have joined. Their academic efforts and achievements rise or fall to conform to their new peers. Do they work hard? I will too. Do they think schoolwork is boring and not worth doing? I agree. 45. Likewise, students who move from politically conservative families to much more liberal environments when they go to college will often become more liberal in their attitudes, unless they maintain close connections with their more conservative reference group at home. Point 46. Reference groups. Groups that we belong to and identify with. Christian Crandall, 47, discovered an especially pernicious effect of group conformity when he examined the body image and eating patterns of women in 2 college sororities. Each sorority differed in its collective attitudes about the ideal female body image and whether binge eating and purging was a desirable way to maintain it. The powerful reference group of the sorority exerted pressure on its members to have the right body type and the right behavior. The more the women hewed to the group ideal of looks and behavior, the more popular they were. Thus, if you were in a sorority where everyone thought you should be thin and yet eat a lot, you'd be more popular if you binged and purged. Social norms. Our discussion of conformity strongly suggests that people form their ideas about what is socially appropriate behavior in a given setting or within a community by observing what other people are doing. The power of that perceived norm over their own beliefs and actions depends on the extent to which they perceive the norm to be universally endorsed, and the extent to which they care about the situation or the community involved. A norm might simply be descriptive, reflecting our knowledge about what most people do in a given situation. Some norms are injunctive, specifying what people should do, often through explicit directives, such as signs prohibiting smoking, cell phone use, or littering. Institutions frequently want to create norms without making an outright demand. Many years ago, during one of California's recurrent droughts, it turned out that only 6% of the students at my university's field house were conforming to the request to take short showers, as the university was requesting. In the previous chapter 1 wrote about the hypocrisy paradigm we used to get people to conserve water. This time, my students and I 48 conducted a simple field experiment aimed at inducing students to shorten their showers by leading them to believe that their peers were shortening theirs. We enlisted the aid of a few male students who acted as role models and observers. Not wanting people to conform out of a fear of disapproval or punishment, we set up the experiment in the following way. Our role model entered the shower room at the university's athletic center when it was empty, went to the far end, turned his back to the entrance, and turned on the shower. As soon as he heard someone enter the shower room, he would turn off the shower, lather up his body with soap, and then briefly rinse off, just as signs posted nearby requested. He'd then leave the room without so much as glancing at the student who had entered. As he left, another student entered and surreptitiously noted whether the subject of our investigation followed suit by turning off the shower while soaping up. We found that 49% of the students conformed, and when two students simultaneously modeled the appropriate behavior, conformity zoomed to 67%. Thus, in an ambiguous situation, other people can induce us to conform by behaving in ways that let us know what most people do in that situation. Let's look at the norms regarding littering. Suppose, as you approach your car in the parking lot of the local library, you notice that someone has stuck one of those annoying flyers under your windshield wiper. So you remove it and, without thinking, crumple it up. The crucial question: do you throw it on the ground or shove it into your pocket so that you can drop it in a trash can later? The answer: to a large extent, it depends on what you think others would do in this setting. In their field experiment, Robert Cialdini and his associates 49 placed flyers under the windshield wipers of a number of cars and waited to observe what people did when they returned to their cars. Sometimes, an accomplice of the experimenters walked past them as they left the library, stooped down, picked up a discarded fast food bag that was lying in the street, and placed it in a trash can. In the control condition, no bag was lying on the ground. The accomplice simply walked past the people who were headed toward their cars. In that situation, when the people got to their car and noticed the flyer, 37% threw it on the ground. In the food bag modeling condition, only 7% threw it on the ground. In a parallel experiment, 50 researchers eliminated the role model and instead manipulated the appearance of the parking lot by littering it with flyers, leaving only a single piece of paper on the ground, or having it be completely clean. Which condition made people least likely to litter? When the ground was covered in paper, the majority of the drivers simply followed suit, probably thinking, after all, if no one cares about the cleanliness of the parking lot, why should I? But they were least likely to litter if a single piece of paper lay on the ground nearby than if the parking lot was completely clean. Why might this be? The one piece of crumpled paper reminds us of the injunctive norm against littering, and shows us that the vast majority of people are following the norm of keeping the lot clean. If the parking lot is free of litter, most people probably do not even think about the norm and therefore are more likely to litter mindlessly. In another set of experiments, Kaiser and his associates 51 took this reasoning a step further, to show that when environmental cues suggest that most people are disregarding the rules, bad behavior and norm breaking are encouraged. Kaiser's team left a large envelope hanging part way out of a public mailbox in an urban area of a city in the Netherlands, as though someone had hurriedly, and unsuccessfully, tried to mail the letter. A €5 bill showed through the address window in the envelope. Would passers-by who saw it push the envelope into the mailbox, or would they steal the envelope with the money? The answer depended on a critical detail manipulated by the experimenters. Sometimes the mailbox had graffiti on it and there was litter strewn about the area. Sometimes the mailbox and surrounding area were clean. In the clean mailbox condition, only 13% of the passers-by stole the envelope. With the graffiti and litter, 27% of the passers-by stole the letter. You may recognize this setup as a test of the broken windows theory, which holds that when the environment sends the message that people don't care, the disorder spreads to human behavior. 52 people seem to say to themselves, "Oh, what the hell? If others are going to behave irresponsibly, I might as well, too." To summarize, people take their cues from others and typically feel uncomfortable when they deviate from the norms of the group they belong to, especially if they value or identify with the group. In many situations the norms are well defined. In other situations, people have no idea about the norms and are forced to infer them from others' actions, which is why the fellow in the shower room, the guy picking up a piece of litter, or the presence of graffiti can be so influential. A number of researchers have used the power of norms to get people to change behavior, sometimes with dramatic success. For example, signs in hotel rooms urging guests to reuse their towels work better when they explicitly say that most other guests in this room have reused theirs. 53. Informing hikers in a national park that very few people broke the rules against collecting petrified would reduce the incidence significantly more than signs that only asked people not to remove the wood. 54. The uninvolved bystander as conformist. Our tendency to conform can also prevent us from taking action when people need our help. In 1964, the New York Times ran a shocking story, one that left a major legacy in the history of social psychological research. A young woman named Kitty Genovese was stabbed to death near her home in Queens, New York. It was a tragic event, but not an especially newsworthy one for New Yorkers at a time when murder rates were much higher than they are today. What made the Genovese case distinctive was that, according to news reports at the time, 38 of her neighbors came to their windows at 3 a.m. in response to her screams of terror, and remained at their windows watching in fascination for the 30 minutes it took her assailant to complete his grisly deed. The New York Times claimed that no one came to her assistance, no one so much as lifted the phone to call the police until it was too late. 55. The story, which turned out to be exaggerated for the sake of sensational headlines, 56 nonetheless articulated many people's deep fears of crime and of social alienation. It produced a rash of speculations and hand-wringing about the apathy of people who live in cities. What's wrong with them? Why would they turn their backs on a neighbor in distress? Maybe the onlookers were sleepy or dazed. After all, people are hardly in full control of their mental faculties at 3 o'clock in the morning. Perhaps, but it was in broad daylight that a 2-year-old girl was run over by 2 vans in Foshan, China. For the next 7 minutes, more than a dozen people, recorded by an impassive security camera, walked or bicycled past her, doing nothing. Eventually, a woman pulled the little girl to the side of the road and she was taken to a hospital, where she died soon thereafter. Why didn't these bystanders rush to help? To begin with, interviews conducted with the bystanders in the Genovese murder revealed them to be anything but nonchalant. They were horrified. Something other than apathy was at play in their apparent unresponsiveness. The Genovese murder launched extensive research designed to identify reasons that a person might fail to intervene when a stranger is in trouble. One reason is cultural norms. 57. Were you to travel the globe dropping pens, faking illness, or pretending to be blind, you would tend to receive more assistance from people in Latin countries, which place a higher value on simpatico, the willingness to offer help to others, than in the United States. You're also more likely to get help in places where the pace of life is slower and there are fewer demands on a passerby's attention. Research led by Robert Levine 58 found helpfulness to be lowest in big crowded cities like New York, where people walk quickly and confront abundant distractions. They need to notice your distress before they can respond to it. A second reason for failing to intervene is that even when people do notice someone in trouble, they may fail to identify it as an emergency. John Darley, Bib Latane, and their colleagues 59 hypothesized that a victim is less likely to get help if many people are watching his or her distress. Their non-intervention is an act of conformity to how other people were defining the reasonableness and appropriateness of helping or not helping. What's the appropriate way to think or feel about what's going on right now? As we have seen, what other people are doing is often the clearest guide. Suppose you encounter a woman lying with a broken leg on a busy street. She is clearly in pain. What else do you see? You see scores of people walking past the woman, glancing at her, and continuing on their way. How will you define the situation? You may conclude that it's inappropriate for you to intervene. Perhaps it's not serious, perhaps she's intoxicated, perhaps the whole thing is being staged for a reality show. After all, you say to yourself, if she's really in trouble, she will have used her cell to call 911. Or someone else would have. And why aren't any of these other people doing anything? Thus we might predict that the very presence of a lot of other people, rather than increasing the likelihood that someone will help, actually decreases the likelihood that anyone will help. This is an interesting conjecture, but is it true? To find out, Bib Latane and Judith Rodan 60 conducted an experiment constructed around a woman in distress. A young woman asked 120 male college students to fill out a questionnaire. She then retired to the next room, saying she would return when the students finished. A few minutes later, she staged an accident. The students heard the sound of the young woman climbing a chair, followed by a loud scream and a crash, as if the chair had collapsed and she had fallen to the floor. They then heard moaning and crying and the anguished statement, "Oh, my God, my foot, I can't move it. Oh, my ankle. I can't get this thing off me." The cries continued for about a minute and gradually subsided. The question, of course, was whether the participants would come to the woman's aid. The important variable in the experiment was whether the young men were alone in the room. Of those who were alone, 70% offered to help her. Of those who were sitting in the room with a stranger, only 20% offered help. Thus, the mere presence of another bystander tends to inhibit action, a phenomenon called the bystander effect. When interviewed subsequently, the unhelpful participants who had been in the room with another person said they had concluded that the accident probably wasn't serious, at least in part because of the inactivity of their partner. Bystander effect. What occurs when another bystander or other bystanders tend to inhibit helpful actions? Another reason, besides conformity, that bystanders may fail to intervene is the diffusion of responsibility. Even if people conclude that the event is a genuine emergency, the awareness of other witnesses diffuses the responsibility felt by any one person. To test this idea, Darley and Latane 61 arranged an experimental situation in which people were placed in separate rooms but were able to communicate with one another by microphones and earphones. They could hear one another but not see one another. The investigators then played a recording imitating the sounds of an epileptic seizure on the part of one of the participants. In one experimental condition, each person was led to believe that he or she was the only one who overheard the seizure. In other conditions, each person was led to believe that one or more people had also heard it. Those who thought they were the only listener were far more likely to leave their room and try to help than were those who thought others were listening, too. As the number of people listening increased, individual responsibility was diffused among them, and the likelihood of offering assistance decreased. Diffusion of responsibility. A phenomenon where the awareness of other witnesses diffuses a bystander's feelings of responsibility to take action. Other factors can enter the calculation of whether to help a stranger, including seemingly trivial ones, as John Darley and Daniel Batson 62 illustrated. They enlisted divinity students at Princeton Theological Seminary, ostensibly for the purpose of recording a speech. Each student practiced his talk in one room, then he was instructed to walk to another building, where his presentation would be taped. At this point, some of the students were told they were late for their appointment and were hurried out. Others were told they were on time, and the rest that they had time to spare. On their way to the other building, the students encountered an apparent victim slumped in a doorway, with head down and eyes closed, coughing pathetically. More than half of these future ministers who were early or on time stopped to assist the victim. But only 10% of those who thought they were late for their appointment offered help, even when the speech they were to deliver included the parable of the Good Samaritan. Apparently the students were too distracted by their lateness and their mission to define the situation as enough of an emergency to get involved. The ease with which people can be led to not intervene projects a rather grim picture of the human condition. But that is not the full picture. Camping in Yosemite National Park many years ago, my family and I heard a man's voice cry out. No one in our tent could be certain whether it was a cry of pain, surprise, or joy. Maybe someone was horsing around? Maybe a fellow camper was being attacked by a bear? What we saw when we left the tent was heartening. From all over the area, myriad flickering lights were converging on a single point. These were lanterns and flashlights being carried by dozens of campers running to the aid of the man who had screamed. It turned out that his scream had been one of surprise caused by a relatively harmless flare-up in his gasoline stove. The other campers seemed almost disappointed when they learned their help wasn't needed. They trudged back to their tents and, I assumed, dropped off to sleep immediately. I, however, couldn't sleep, puzzled by the contradiction between what had just happened and the bystander effect. Why had these campers behaved so differently? In what way were the situations different? There were at least two factors operating in the campground that were either not present or present only to a small degree in the situations previously discussed. One is reflected in my use of the term, our fellow campers. Specifically, a feeling of common fate or mutuality may be engendered among people sharing the same interests, pleasures, hardships, and environmental conditions of a closed environment like a campground, a stronger feeling of mutuality than exists among people who are merely residents of the same country, county, or city. A second factor is that there was no escape from the face-to-face aspect of the situation. In a big city, people can walk away from a stranger in trouble. The participants in the Darlie-Latane experiments were not in a face-to-face relationship with the victim, and they knew they could escape from the environment in a short time. In the campground, we were all there together. The campers were going to have to face squarely the next morning whatever they had allowed to happen the night before. It seems that, under these circumstances, individuals are more willing to take responsibility for one another. Of course, I'm speculating. The helpfulness of the campers at Yosemite is not conclusive because it was not part of a controlled experiment. One of the major problems with observational data like these is that the observer has no control over who the people in the situation are. Perhaps campers, by nature or experience, are kinder, gentler, more thoughtful, and more humane than urban dwellers. Perhaps they were Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts as children, hence their interest in camping, and in scouting, they were taught to be helpful to other people. One of the reasons for doing experiments is to control this kind of uncertainty, and indeed, a subsequent experiment by Irving Pilyavin and his associate 63 supported my speculations about the campground experience. In their experiment, an accomplice of the experimenters staggered and collapsed in a New York City subway car, in the presence of several other people. The victim remained stretched out on the floor of the train, staring at the ceiling. This scene was repeated 103 times under a variety of conditions. The most striking result was that, a large part of the time, people spontaneously rushed to the aid of the victim, especially when he was made to seem obviously ill. In more than 95% of the trials, someone offered help immediately. Even when the victim had been given a liquor bottle to carry and was made to reek of alcohol, he received immediate help on 50% of the trials. Unlike the behavior of the participants that Darlie and Latane dealt with, the helping behavior of the people on the subway train was not affected by the number of bystanders. People helped just as often and just as speedily on crowded trains as they did on virtually empty trains. Although the people in the New York subway were in an environment as unlike Yosemite National Park as could be, the subway and the campground had two things in common. People had the feeling of sharing a common fate, and they were in a face-to-face situation with the victim from which there was no immediate escape. Today, after decades of research on bystander apathy and bystander intervention, we have a better idea of the influences on both of these responses. A meta-analysis of the many studies done since the first identification of the bystander effect offers cause for optimism. In truly dangerous, unambiguous emergencies, a child is drowning, people are being shot at by a deranged gunman in a school, movie theater, or street, or a terrorist attack, people are more likely to intervene to help. And in fact are often spurred to do so by the presence of others. Indeed, they will rush in to help in stunningly generous ways, sometimes risking their own safety. 64 After the terrorist bombing at the Boston Marathon in 2013, many bystanders actually ran into the most dangerous area to help survivors. What conditions make apathy or altruism more likely? The sense of a common fate is clearly activated, and they are in face-to-face situations with victims. When these conditions are lacking, individuals make a quick, often unconscious assessment of whether or not they should get involved. Is the situation really serious? Does it require my personal intervention? Will helping be difficult or costly for me? Will my help benefit the victim? Can I easily leave? Your response to the situation will depend on your answers to each of these questions. Pluralistic ignorance. Norms even govern our inner emotions and how and when we are expected to express them. Most people conform to the display rules of demonstrating sadness at funerals, happiness at weddings, and affection toward relatives. What if we don't actually feel sad, happy, or affectionate? Acting out an emotion we do not really feel because we believe it is socially appropriate is called emotion work. Point 65. Sometimes emotion work is a normative job requirement. Flight attendants, servers in restaurants, and customer service representatives must put on a happy face to convey cheerfulness, even if they are privately angry about a rude or drunken customer. Bill collectors must put on a stern face to convey threat, even if they feel sorry for the person they are collecting money from. Point 66. Conforming to display rules may smooth out our social interactions, but our use of others to define situations for us can be especially problematic where strong feelings are involved that people are afraid to show, or are trying to conform to what is expected of them. People often consider it uncool to reveal certain emotions in public, so we try to appear less fearful, worried, depressed, anxious, or sexually aroused than we really are. For example, from the blasé looks on the faces of patrons of strip clubs, one might never guess that they were sexually aroused or even interested. Similarly, the proverbial visitor from Mars might not realize the anxiety of the adult patients in a dentist's waiting room by observing the impassive looks on their faces. Thus, it can be misleading to judge the seriousness of a situation by looking to others' emotional expressions, because people often hide their true feelings behind a poker face. This can create a situation that social psychologists call pluralistic ignorance, the collective belief in a false norm created by the ambiguous behavior of others. The classic setting to see pluralistic ignorance in action is the college classroom. Imagine that your professor has just explained an extremely complicated concept. She turns to the class to check to see if everyone understands. Any questions? Anyone not get this? She asks. As a matter of fact, you don't get it, and you sure would appreciate some further explanation. You glance around the room nonchalantly to see if you are alone in your confusion and find nothing but the nonchalant expressions of your classmates. They make you worry that you alone are confused, and this raises the stakes of your raising your hand to admit you don't get it. In reality, many of your classmates are having the same experience, partly from looking at your blank face. Pluralistic ignorance can be a serious barrier to classroom effectiveness, yet it is overcome easily with technology that allows students to answer anonymously in real time to potentially embarrassing questions like, "Anyone not get this?" Pluralistic ignorance. The collective belief in a false norm created by the ambiguous behavior of others. Binge drinking on college campuses is also promoted by pluralistic ignorance, because students must infer norms from the behavior of their peers. And that norm creates serious problems. 2 out of 3 college students who consume alcohol engage in binge drinking, not infrequently to blacking out, which causes nearly 1,800 deaths each year and leads to other high-risk behaviors, such as unsafe sex and sexual assault. 67 Yet surveys show that most college students believe that they themselves are more uncomfortable drinking heavily than their peers are, so of course they drink more in order to match their perceived norm. What to do? Dale Miller and Deborah Prentice 68 have found that merely giving students accurate information about their fellow students' alcohol consumption and their true feelings about binge drinking reduced conformity, and lowered the rate of drinking. A similar study assigned first-year students to either a peer-oriented discussion, which made them aware of pluralistic ignorance, or an individual-oriented discussion, which focused on making decisions about drinking. 4 to 6 months later, students in the peer-oriented condition reported drinking significantly less than did students in the individual-oriented condition. The strength of the drinking norm had been weakened. 69 Change the perceived norms and people's behavior follows suit. Pluralistic ignorance can literally be a killer. For example, despite a general drop in homicide over the past decade, Black Americans are nearly 8 times as likely as white Americans to be murder victims. Gang-related homicide in urban areas remains stubbornly high. In his breakthrough approach to reducing the murder rate among urban gangs, the legendary criminologist David Kennedy 70 spent hundreds of hours getting to know the young men. The police had described them as heartless, fearless, sociopaths, so Kennedy was surprised when he learned, by interviewing the gang members, that most of them were scared, hated the violence, and wanted normal lives. They talked very tough when they were in groups, and that's why the cops would think they were sociopaths, Kennedy wrote, but when I'd get them alone, they'd confess they were scared to death. To show fear in front of your gang members is dangerous, so everyone looks around and thinks they alone hate the life. Kennedy and his team began their intervention by confronting this pluralistic ignorance, which Kennedy described as the condition where everybody in a group believes that everybody in the group believes something that nobody in the group believes. By bringing the police and gang members together and unveiling their actual feelings of horror and despair about what was going on, they were able to begin a process that substantially reduced gang violence and the homicide rate in several major cities. 71. Levels of conformity. Thus far, I have been describing two motives for conformity, whether a person is motivated by the desire to fit in and belong, or by a need to be correct. Let us move beyond these simple distinctions to a more complex and useful classification, distinguishing among three levels of conformity: compliance, identification, and internalization. 72. The term compliance best describes the behavior of a person who is motivated by a desire to gain reward or avoid punishment. Typically, the person's behavior is only as long-lived as the promise of reward or the threat of punishment. You can get a rat to run a maze efficiently by making it hungry and placing food at the end of the maze. A ruthless dictator could get a percentage of his citizens to swear their allegiance by threatening them with torture if they don't comply or by promising to feed and enrich them if they do. Remove the threat of punishment or the benefits of riches, however, and the citizens will cease showing allegiance to the dictator. Compliance is the least enduring and has the least effect on the individual, because the person's behavior changes as soon as the rewards or punishments change. Compliance describes the behavior of a person motivated by the desire for reward or to avoid punishment. The term identification describes a level of conformity brought about by an individual's desire to be like the group or role model they admire. In identification, as in compliance, we do not behave in a particular way because such behavior is intrinsically satisfying. Rather, we do it because it puts us in a satisfying relationship with the person or persons with whom we are identifying. Identification differs from compliance in that we do come to believe in the opinions and values we adopt, although we may not believe in them very strongly. Thus, if we find a person or a group appealing in some way, we will be inclined to let that person or group influence us by adopting their values and attitudes. Identification. A response to social influence brought about by an individual's desire to be like the influencer. I think of this as the good old Uncle Harry and Aunt Harriet phenomenon. Suppose you have an uncle and aunt who are warm, dynamic, and exciting. Ever since you were a young child, you loved these elders and wanted to grow up to be like them. By the time you are in college, you have incorporated their political beliefs, left, right, or center, into your own, not because you have examined those beliefs carefully or acquired them through your own experience, or even because you were rewarded for adopting their views. Rather, their opinions have become part of your belief system because you love those relatives so much and want to be like them. This phenomenon occurs often when we encounter the opinions of people we like or admire, even relative strangers. Jeffrey Cohen and Michael Prinstein 73 asked high school students to participate in online chat room discussions with one another. One of the topics being discussed was what students would do if offered marijuana at a party. In one condition, the participants were led to believe that they were chatting with two popular and admired classmates from their school. In the other, these classmates were identified as students of merely average popularity. When the teenagers believed they were chatting with the popular classmates, they were far more likely to adopt their opinions. If the admired classmates said they would smoke the marijuana, the participants tended to agree that they would do so as well. If the admired classmates said they would refuse the marijuana, so did the participants. Unlike the kind of conformity in the Ash experiment, which was merely compliance, the influence here was durable. It was evident even later when participants were asked to give their opinions about marijuana in private. Continuous reward or punishment is not necessary for identification. You can identify with someone who isn't present at all, you just need to want to be like that person. If your aunt and uncle move to a different city and months go by without your seeing them, you will continue to hold beliefs similar to theirs as long as they remain important to you. They still hold the same beliefs, and their beliefs are not challenged by counter-opinions that are more convincing to you. Conversely, your beliefs can be changed if your relatives change their political beliefs, or if you find other people who are more important to you and who profess different beliefs. In that case, you may change your mind because you are now more strongly identifying with your new reference group. Finally, the internalization of a value or belief is the most permanent level of conformity. The motivation to internalize a belief is the desire to be right. If we admire someone whom we perceive to be trustworthy and to have good judgment, we accept the belief that he or she advocates and integrate it into our system of values. Once we have internalized a belief and made it our own, it becomes independent of its source and will become extremely resistant to change, as we saw in the discussion of self-justification in the previous chapter. Internalization is therefore the most permanent level of conformity precisely because the motivation to be right, and to believe that we are right, is a powerful and self-sustaining force that does not depend upon constant surveillance in the form of agents of reward or punishment, as does compliance. Or on our continued esteem for another person or group, as does identification. Internalization. The most deeply rooted response to social influence, motivation to internalize a particular belief rooted in the desire to be right. Any specific action may be rooted in compliance, identification, or internalization. Let us look at a simple piece of behavior, obedience to speed limits. Most people conform to the speed limit to avoid paying a penalty if they are caught. That's compliance. They are obeying the law. If the police were told to stop enforcing the law, many people would exceed the speed limit. But some would continue to obey because, let's say, Dad always stressed the importance of obeying traffic laws, and they admire their dad and want to drive the way he does. Their reason for conforming is identification. Finally, people might conform to the speed limit, whether or not Dad or the police are nearby, because they are convinced that speed laws are good, that obeying such laws helps to prevent accidents, and that driving at a moderate speed is a sane and reasonable form of behavior. Their reason for conforming is internalization. Obedience as a form of compliance. Acts of compliance are almost always ephemeral. This does not mean they are trivial. People can commit an act only once or twice, but it might have far-reaching consequences, as Stanley Milgram demonstrated in a classic series of studies of obedience. 74 His studies, first done in the early 1960s, became world famous, with books written and films made about them, because their message was not entirely what people wanted to hear. Picture the scene in his initial experiment. 40 men volunteer for a project advertised as a study of learning and memory. But this is just the cover story. Actually, it is a study of the extent to which people will obey authority. When the volunteer appears at the lab for his appointment, he is paired with another man, and a somewhat stern experimenter in a technician's coat explains that they will be testing the effects of punishment on learning. The exercise requires one person, the learner, to memorize a list of word pairs on which the other person, the teacher, will test him. The two men draw slips to determine their roles. The actual participant draws the role of teacher. He is led to a shock generator, which has an instrument panel with a row of 30 toggle switches, calibrated from a low point of 15 volts and extending through levels of moderate and higher shocks to a high of 450 volts. By throwing the successive switches, the teacher will deliver an increasingly intense shock each time the learner fails to answer correctly. Then the teacher follows the experimenter and the learner into the next room, where the learner is strapped into an electric chair apparatus and attached by electrodes to the shock generator. In response to the learner's inquiry about his mild heart condition, the experimenter reassures him, although the shocks can be extremely painful, they cause no permanent tissue damage. In actuality, the learner knows that he needn't worry. He is an accomplice of the experimenter, and the drawing to assign roles has been rigged so that he will play the role of the learner and the real participant will be the teacher. The learner never receives any jolt of electricity, but the teacher has no reason to doubt that the man in the next room is wired to the shock generator that he operates. He has even experienced a sample shock himself. He hears the learner react as if he is really being hurt, and he is convinced that the shocks are extremely painful. As the exercise begins, the learner responds correctly several times but makes mistakes on a few trials. With each error, the teacher throws the next switch, supposedly administering a shock of increased intensity. With the fifth shock, at 75 volts, the victim begins to grunt and moan. At 150 volts, he asks to be let out of the experiment. At 180 volts, he cries out that he can't stand the pain. As the shock levels approach the point labeled danger, severe shock, the teacher hears the learner pound the wall and beg to be released. But this, of course, does not constitute a correct response, so the experimenter instructs the teacher to increase the voltage and deliver the next shock by throwing the next switch. At 300 volts, the learner stops responding altogether. The participants in this experiment were a random sample of businessmen, professionals, white-collar workers, and blue-collar workers in Connecticut. What percentage of them continued to administer shocks to the XXX at the very end of the experiment? How long would you have continued? Before the experiment began, Milgram posed these questions to 40 psychiatrists at a leading medical school. The psychiatrists predicted that most participants would quit at 150 volts, when the victim first asks to be freed. They also predicted that only about 4% would continue to shock the victim after he stopped responding, and that fewer than 1 in 100 would administer the highest shock on the generator. The psychiatrists were completely wrong. The great majority of the participants, some 67%, continued to administer shocks to the maximum level, although some of them required prodding from the experimenter. The obedient individuals did not continue administering shocks because they were sadistic or cruel. Indeed, when Milgram and Alan Elms later compared people's scores on a series of standardized personality tests, they discovered no differences between those who were fully obedient and those who successfully resisted the pressure to obey. 75 nor were obedient people insensitive to the apparent plight of the learner. Some protested, many sweated, trembled, stuttered, and showed other signs of tension. Some burst out in fits of nervous laughter. But they continued to obey to the very end. This behavior is not limited to American men living in Connecticut. Wherever the Milgram procedure has been tried, it has produced a significant degree of obedience. Several replications of the experiment 76 have demonstrated that people in Australia, Jordan, Spain, Germany, and the Netherlands react in much the same way as the men in Milgram's original experiment, and women are just as obedient as men. 77. A replication of the basic Milgram procedure conducted in 2007 by Jerry Berger shows that high levels of obedience in the Milgram experiment are not artifacts of a bygone era. Modern Americans are every bit as susceptible to being led to shock an innocent victim as were their counterparts in Milgram's time, nearly 60 years ago. 78. Real-world implications, and limitations, of the Milgram experiment. Milgram's unwelcome and controversial message was that an astonishingly large proportion of people will cause pain to other people when an authority figure orders them to obey. It is difficult to read about these studies without applying them to the world outside the experimental laboratory, for example by noticing some similarity between the behavior of the teachers in Milgram's experiment and the blind obedience of the Nazi officers who obeyed orders to exterminate millions of innocent people who were not pure Aryans. At his trial for crimes against humanity, conducted when Milgram was doing his studies, Adolf Eichmann justified his actions by claiming he was a good bureaucrat, merely obeying orders issued by his superiors in the Nazi regime. During the Iraq War, American soldiers guarding Iraqi prisoners of war subjected them to torture and humiliation in the notorious Abu Ghraib prison. 79. Although military leaders were quick to blame this behavior on a few bad apples, and court-martialed them, the facts suggest that Abu Ghraib was another instance of obedience to authority. The soldiers who tortured their prisoners claimed that they were just following orders. Milgram's obedient participants likewise had many justifications for their behavior. It wasn't their fault, they kept saying. They were only doing their job. One man, when questioned after the session, replied, "I stopped, but he kept going." As provocative as these comparisons are, we should be cautious lest we overinterpret Milgram's results. Given that 67% of the participants complied with the experimenter's command, some commentators have suggested that perhaps most people would have behaved as Adolf Eichmann did had they found themselves in a similar situation. This may be true, but we should also notice some important points of difference. Because each man in Milgram's study freely consented to participate, he had every reason to assume that the learner had also volunteered. Accordingly, it is likely that he felt that they were both obligated to avoid disrupting the experiment. Moreover, each participant faced the demands of the experimenter alone. Just as conformity dropped in the Ash experiment with the presence of one dissenter, the proportion of fully obedient people in a variation of the Milgram paradigm dropped to just 10% when they were joined by two fellow teachers who defied the experimenter's orders to continue. Also, in most of Milgram's studies, the authority figure issuing the orders was a scientist in a prestigious laboratory at Yale University, and his cover story credits the experiment as being an investigation of an important scientific question. The participants naturally assumed that the experimenter at a highly respected institution like Yale would be a responsible, benevolent professional. Surely he would not issue orders that would result in the death or injury of a human being as a part of his experiment. Indeed, when Milgram moved the study from Yale University to a suite of offices in industrial Bridgeport, a few miles away, full obedience dropped to 48%. Removing the prestige of Yale University considerably reduced the degree of obedience. Of course, 48% is still a high figure. Would even fewer people have obeyed if the person conducting the experiment were not a scientist or another legitimate authority figure? Milgram addressed this question in another version of the study, in which the scientist experimenter was replaced at the last minute by a non-authoritative substitute. This time only 20% delivered the full set of shocks, demonstrating that for most people, only legitimate authority can command high obedience, not just any person assuming the role of authority. Finally, the physical proximity of the authority figure also plays a role in whether people obey. Milgram found that when the experimenter was out of the room and issued his orders by telephone, the number of fully obedient participants dropped to below 25%. Moreover, released from the close scrutiny of the experimenter, several of the people who continued to administer shocks cheated. They administered shocks of lower intensity than they were ordered to, and never bothered to tell the experimenter that they had deviated from the proper procedure. I regard that finding as their touching attempt to respond to the demands of legitimate authority while at the same time minimizing the pain they inflict on others. It reminds me of Dunbar, a character in Joseph Heller's classic World War II novel Catch-22. Dunbar is ordered to bomb villages in Italy. Unwilling either to rebel openly or to harm innocent civilians, he drops his bombs over empty fields close to the Italian villages designated as his targets. Dunbar's sensitivity to the potential victims of his bombs is especially poignant given the distance and anonymity afforded by his position high in the sky above the villagers. The operators of drones in today's warfare are even more removed from their victims. Vividly witnessing the suffering of others makes it more difficult to continue inflicting pain upon them. Indeed, Milgram found in subsequent studies that the farther teachers were from the learner, the more willing they were to obey the commands of authority. When teachers actually saw the learner, only 40% continued to deliver painful shocks, compared with 67% who merely heard the learner's cries of agony. Similarly, when teachers were required to physically force the learner's hand down onto the shock plate, instead of using the remote shock generator, the rate of obedience dropped to 30%. Still, proximity cannot explain all of the results. After all, 30% of Milgram's participants continued to deliver shocks to their victims, even when doing so required physical contact. 80. In a set of experiments conducted in the Netherlands, Wim Mees and Quinten Ragemakers 81 explored the issue of obedience and distance in a slightly different manner. In addition to successfully replicating the original Milgram procedure, they tried a new approach. They asked people to obey by making a series of increasingly negative remarks about an applicant's performance on a test that would determine whether he or she would be hired for a job. The participants were convinced that they were harming the person, but the harm would not be manifested until some future time, when they would not be present to witness the consequences of their obedience. Obedience in these situations was much higher than in the direct replication of the Milgram experiment. In this version, more than 90% of the participants continued to obey to the very end of the series. Although the Milgram studies, like the atrocities that took place during the Holocaust, Vietnam, and Iraq, and continue today in the countless other wars that plague our planet, certainly underscore the fallibility of human nature in the face of pressures to conform. The extremity and exotic nature of these studies can lull us into thinking that destructive obedience is beyond the realm of everyday life. After all, when was the last time someone asked you to deliver deadly shocks to a kindly stranger with a heart condition or hide a family of Jews in your basement? But if we look around, we can see that many of us, whether we recognize it or not, are in positions where conforming to the wishes of a group or people in authority will have serious consequences for others. To take but one example, for the past 2 decades, American public schools have been under increasing pressure to improve students' academic performance. Legislation called No Child Left Behind mandated that all schools make progress every year, to be measured by standardized tests. If you attended public school in the last 15 years, you probably were aware to some degree of the pressure your school was under. The law mandated that unless a school demonstrated improvement in student test scores, it would be shamed or punished. Faced with this situation, many teachers and administrators sought to raise their students' scores one way or another to please the authorities. In some cases they did so by eliminating recess and increasing class time or narrowing the curriculum and making classes more about test prep than the joy of learning or discovery. Some teachers even cheated, correcting wrong answers on student tests. Julian Vasquez-Heilig and Linda Darling, Hammond 82 found that many educators went beyond these measures in order to comply with pressure from above, sometimes in ways that were devastating to children. Some schools would cook up rationales to suspend underperforming Black and Latino students days before the test, so that their low scores would not figure into the school average. Others would expel such students or encourage them to drop out. In a particularly diabolical maneuver, some schools promoted low-scoring 9th graders to the 11th grade. Hopelessly over their heads, the students would invariably flounder and then drop out of the 11th grade. What a mockery these instances were of No Child Left Behind and Every Student Succeeds. These strategies may seem less cruel than administering electric shocks, but when we consider that 30% of Black male high school dropouts will end up in prison and potentially marked for life as failures, we can appreciate the relevance of Milgram's findings for our most ubiquitous institution. Indeed, one of Jerry Berger's fully compliant participants gave this chilling response when asked if she was surprised that she had followed Berger's orders to the end, delivering the maximum level of shock to the learner. "I guess I'm not completely surprised," she said. "After all, I'm a teacher." A note on the ethics of the Milgram experiments. The Milgram experiment generated considerable debate at the time, and it continues to this day. It is certainly true that in their quest for knowledge, experimental social psychologists occasionally subject people to some fairly intense experiences. These procedures raise ethical problems, which I will discuss more fully in Chapter 9. Here, I want to make 2 points. First, it is the responsibility of all experimenters to protect their participants from harm. The experimenter must take steps to ensure that participants leave the experimental situation in a frame of mind that is at least as sound as it was when they entered the experimental situation. This frequently requires post-experimental debriefing procedures that sometimes need more time and effort than the main body of the experiment. The vast majority of Milgram's participants, especially those who went all the way, felt they had learned something deeply important about themselves. Debriefing. The procedure whereby the purpose of the study and exactly what transpired is explained to participants at the end of an experiment. But perhaps the great message of the Milgram experiments lies precisely in the discomfort it generates and the reactions of people who think, "I would never do that." Every year in our social psychology classes, before discussing Milgram's findings, Joshua and I have asked students how far they think they would go. Every year, some 99% of the 250 to 300 students say that they would not continue to administer shocks after the learner began to pound on the wall. They are always confident that they would defy the experimenter's instructions. But once, many years ago in a class of 300 students, I asked for the usual show of hands of those who thought they might obey fully. One hand slowly rose. It belonged to a Vietnam veteran who had obeyed an order that, in retrospect, he knew would be considered a war crime. He understood that he was capable of doing what Milgram's participants had done. This brings me to my second point. which is that social psychologists are obligated to use their research skills to advance our knowledge and understanding of human behavior for the ultimate aim of human betterment. They face a dilemma when their general ethical responsibility to society conflicts with their more specific ethical responsibility to each individual experimental participant. That conflict is greatest when they are investigating such issues as conformity, obedience, and helping, because the more important the issue, the more likely it is that a participant will feel uncomfortable, anxious, or upset, but in exchange, the greater the potential benefit for the individual's self-knowledge and for society. Countering conformity. Most of the time, the human tendency to conform to social norms and to our reference groups keeps societies functioning. And obviously it is adaptive, most of the time, for people to obey the laws, regulations, and requirements of their jobs and governments. But while social psychologists study these necessary activities of the social animal, they also want to understand the conditions under which people resist conformity and obedience, sometimes at risk of their lives. After all, if everyone simply conformed to the opinion of majorities, and if everyone obeyed unjust, discriminatory laws or commands to carry out illegal acts, there would be little progress in society. Rosa Parks refused to sit at the back of the bus. Joseph Darby blew the whistle on his fellow soldiers at Abu Ghraib who were committing acts of torture. Mark Felt, the government insider who came to be known as Deep Throat, told reporters about the criminal cover-up in the Nixon White House. And the fact that most Americans now support once unpopular ideas like gay and interracial marriage shows that minority positions can prevail under certain conditions. What are they? 83. If the people holding a minority view express their position consistently, with confidence, conviction, and dogged persistence. If the minority used to agree with the majority position but changed their minds. If the minority is willing to compromise, even just a bit. If group members who are in the majority are motivated to make an accurate decision rather than a quick one. Under such conditions, the majority can be moved to think more deeply about the issue and consider its merits, rather than mindlessly going along, conforming to the norms and beliefs of the crowd. But these factors are rarely enough if we are on our own. We need allies to move others. After all, without an ally it is hard to resist the kind of social pressure that sways most of us. To be the lone representative of a group or an opinion is hard even for esteemed experts. Sandra Day O'Connor, the first female Supreme Court justice, endured many years as the only woman on the court, an experience she described as asphyxiating. When she was joined on the court some years later by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, she described the change as night and day. 84 Empowered by the presence of a single ally reduces the pressure immensely, increases the currency of our convictions, and reduces the tendency of others to write us off as an outlier. When dissenters have enough allies, they can move the majority to broaden their thinking and envision new solutions to old problems. As the anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed, organized citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. 5. Mass communication, propaganda, and persuasion. Saul Steinberg, Untitled Drawing, Ink on Paper. Published in Steinberg, The Labyrinth, 1960. Drawings of a coat of arms, crown, flags, and different shapes are shown emerging from the man's mouth. Every day you are subjected to hundreds of people trying to sell you a product, a trip, or an idea, persuade you they're right, convince you to vote their way, make you angry about some injustice, make you afraid of some outside danger, or seduce or charm you into doing what they want. And every day you are subjected to thousands of ads that you can't escape any more than you can escape breathing. Ads interrupt what you're reading online, pop up in the margins of websites, are on every purchase, precede most television, and are on every gas pump, ATM, and bus bench. Of all the rapid changes in modern life, nothing compares with the rapid evolution in technology in the way we use it to entertain ourselves, communicate, and influence others, and the way others influence us through what comes at us through our televisions, computers, smartphone screens, and other media. This chapter will therefore begin with a look at the current landscape of mass communication and its effects on its consumers. I will then focus on persuasion, which occurs when communication from one person changes the opinions, attitudes, or behavior of another person. Persuasion. A communication from one person that changes the opinions, attitudes, or behavior of another person. How easy is it to persuade a person? The answer depends in part on whether we are dealing with opinions or attitudes. An opinion is what a person believes to be true. It is my opinion that eating vegetables is good for me, that wearing seatbelts reduces traffic fatalities, and that it's important to take vitamins every day. Such opinions are primarily